As a church, we've been in this series looking through the book of Acts, which tells the story of the early church and sort of wrestling with this question, does Jesus still matter? In the world we live in today, which is 2,000 years removed from the beginning of this whole movement of what we call Christianity, in a vastly different world, faster world, high-tech world, high-speed world, does the message of Jesus make a difference? Does it impact our lives? And we as a church believe the answer is a resounding yes. That in fact, the life and the world of the book of Acts is very much similar to the world that we live in today, and that Jesus' message has power in our lives today. And this morning, as we continue in that series, as we look into the book of Acts in Acts chapter 12, we begin to have Luke, as he lays out this story of the early church, and he tells us the story that's surrounded of some of the main people, is that we come to a time where there is a real contrast that can bring up some deep and powerful and disturbing questions for us about who God is and his presence and his power. A few years back, when we were doing one of our family gatherings, church gatherings, and we'd gotten a bunch of the inflatable playthings that were out there in the parking lot. So we always do the obstacle course, right? So you can race against each other, climbing up and sliding down and everything. But this one year, we got the jousting game. The jousting game, so it's inflatable thing, and then there's two pedestals in the middle of it. And two people grab one of those jousts with the padded ends on it, sticks with the ends on it. You put a helmet on, and the goal is to knock the other person off of their pedestal, right? It's great fun, right? Yeah, particularly if you're the one knocking people off instead of being knocked off, type of thing. But the idea is to get that that body blow or whack them in the head, and then they knock off and fall off. The problem is that in real life is that game happens to us, doesn't it? And particularly in the life of faith of following Jesus, is that we can come up against things, we can experience things that can be that body blow or that headshot that tempts to knock us off the foundation and the pedestal of our faith, where we begin to question God and his goodness and his character. And it almost always revolves around this whole question of evil, of bad things, good people. Where's God in the midst of that? And that's what we're going to come to in this story in chapter 12. And I want to read this section. We're going to start in verse 1 to read this, and then we're going to dive into it. So Acts chapter 12, verse 1. It's about that time Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword, and when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. And this was during the days of unleavened bread. Unleavened bread, that season was a Passover season, the time around Passover. Verse 4, and when he had seized Peter, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. Verse 6, now when Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to Peter, and a light shone in the cell, and he struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, get up quickly, and the chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, dress yourself and put on your sandals. And he did so, and he said to him, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. And he went out and followed him. And Peter did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed the first and the second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city, and it opened for them of its own accord. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel left him. When Peter came to himself, he said, now I'm sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. Verse 12, when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. And recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. And they said to her, "You're out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so, and they kept saying, "It's his angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they opened, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison, and he said, "Tell these things to James and to the brothers." And then he departed and went to another place. Now when day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter, and after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries and ordered that they should be put to death. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and spent time there. It's an amazing story because Pastor Nick last week, as he was, continuing this series, he was telling us that persecution was happening in the city of Jerusalem, and what's going on here that we're seeing happen is that what Jesus said right at the beginning of the book of Acts, in Acts 1:8, where he told his disciples, those who were gathered, he says, "But wait, and when my power comes upon you, when my spirit comes upon you, you will go and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea, Samaria, and to the other ends of the earth." And we were seeing last week that as the early followers of Jesus, as they became more persecuted and they were pushed out of Jerusalem into other places, that last week we saw that there was the first report of these early Jewish followers of Jesus going to non-Jewish people and beginning to preach the gospel to the outer ends of the earth. That we're seeing this lived out, and that's really what the book of Acts is all about, is that you always have to go back to Acts 1:8, to what Jesus said was going to happen. And Luke is recording this happening. And so the church is growing, good things are happening, positive things are happening, but whenever positive things happen and growth happens on a spiritual side of things, there is always resistance. Has anybody ever experienced that on a personal basis in your life? Right? That you're wanting to move forward, you're wanting to take steps forward, you feel like good things are happening, and it's like all of a sudden it's like, bam, what's going on? What's up? And it seems like evil is winning. And that's where we start in this story. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. When he saw that pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now, Herod is sort of a common name for leaders, and you might be thinking, if you're familiar with the Bible story, this is a Herod of Jesus' time, but it's not. That was a different Herod. At the time of Jesus' day. This is Herod Agrippa. That was Herod the Great during the time of Jesus. This is a grandson of Herod the Great. And he carries on sort of this evil that his grandfather perpetuated in his positions of power. And so Herod Agrippa had control and power. He was the political force over this area that Jerusalem was a part of. And Herod was a really good politician. He was a really good politician in that he made it about what was good for his power and his career, not about what was right. Now, even today, when we look at sort of the world of politics, it's a very cynical world that when we look at it, we can get very cynical. Because we can see people who can be good people and have really good intentions and have a desire to make changes in the world. And so in order to do that, they need to get elected. And so they have to get enough people who are going to be on their side to do that. And sort of very quickly, it almost becomes anything goes in order to be able to get that. And then there's a realization once you are in power that you have to stay in power. And so it goes from the thing about having good intentions and doing what is right and what is best to how do I keep the power that I have? How do I keep the control and influence that I have? And things start to come not about what is right and what is good, but about what I want and what I need. And things seem to be getting out of control in this whole Jesus movement of the way of these early followers of Jesus. And so Herod, recognizing the sort of the political realities of his supporters were the Jewish people. He was a Jewish leader under the power of the Roman government, that he needed to figure out how to please them. And so he arrested and he killed James. James was the brother of John. John and James. James would have been one of Jesus's disciples. John was the disciple that Jesus loved the most. And this is, James is John's brother. He would have been, a close person to Jesus. He was an essential and central part of the early church. And Herod killed him with a sword. Now, it's sort of interesting that within this is that the Jewish rulers and governors, they didn't have the power to execute anybody. They didn't have the power over life and death. That would only rested with the Roman government. But here, Herod felt that he could bend the rules, that he could get away with it enough, and that he went and he killed James. And he arrested Peter. He saw, well, they like that thing about James. That helped me to have some people on my side. We're going to go after Peter. But it was at the time of Passover, this time of unleavened bread. And so he puts him in prison. But he hasn't forgotten about him because he's a political guy. He says, well, it's not going to be good for me to do something that extreme during the Passover time period. I'll wait until it's over. And as we think about this, we can assume as well that James and Peter weren't the only ones who experienced the wrath and the violence of Herod during this time. Is that there others would have been caught in the wave of Herod's political power. And so that's where this story starts, is that you have good things happening, you have the church moving, and evil comes up against it. And one person, one close follower of Jesus, beloved of Jesus, is murdered, and another's in prison, and others suffer. Now, in this story, one of the contrasts we see is we have a contrast between the power and the powerless. And so Peter and James and the early church, they were the powerless in the midst of this. And here we have Herod, who has all the power. He has the wealth. He has the political connections. He has the support of the Roman government. That's the only reason that he would be in that place, is that they trusted him and believed that Herod would do what Rome wanted him to do. He has wealth, all the things on his side that would give him the power to do whatever he wanted. And then you have, in contrast to that, you have the early church. And when we see the early church, one of the things you have to really understand is that the early church was not made up of the people of political influence and of power and of wealth. In fact, you have to sort of look back in the life of Jesus, and Jesus hung out with notorious sinners. He hung out with the people who were on the edges of society. He hung out with the people who were the least of these in society. And it was those people who were turning and discovering and finding the love and the grace of God shown through Jesus. And so the early church would have been made up primarily of that. We do see some influential people. We do see some wealthy people who are showing up. It's not exclusive, but the majority would have been definitely the powerless within the way that we define power today, and they would have defined power then. So when you're powerless and you come up against power, what do you do? And we see a clear picture of that here. In Acts 12:5, it says, "So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church." And then down in verse 12, it sort of repeats this. When Peter was delivered, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. How the powerless respond to crisis is as they turn to the one who is ultimately power, God. What does it take for you to turn to God in your life? Now, yesterday at our guys' breakfast, it happens the second Saturday of every month at 7:30 over here in Faith Hall. One of the things we do is we ask different people to share their story, and Walter Bringolf shared his story of his walk with God and his journey of faith. And Walt's wife, Dana, is the one you saw in the video with Kids Camp. She's the director of our Kids Camp. Walter, he teaches at Providence Christian School. And a big part of their journey is their son, Isaac. And when Isaac, at about 6 weeks old, Isaac began to have seizures. And as they began to explore that, they discovered that, and the seizures continued to get worse and worse and more prolonged, that the ultimate decision was that he needed to have brain surgery. And he had to have half of his brain removed. And Walter told about, interacting with the doctor before one of these surgeries, that the surgeon was saying, doctor saying to him, he says, if you drink, this would be a really good time to have a strong, stiff one. Or if you pray, this would be a good time to pray. Sort of an interesting contrast, that he would give. But it really is the contrast of the world that we live around. Are you going to numb yourself to the reality of what you are going through, that there's a really good chance that really bad things can happen, and so just get drunk, just numb yourself? Or are you going to turn to the one who holds all things in his hands and that you can trust? For Walt and Dana, they prayed. And you'll get to see Isaac probably today. When you face crisis and challenge, what do you do? I got to be honest with you. When I face a challenge and crisis, the way that I'm wired is I want to do something. I mean, I physically want to move and do something. And in my first thought, my first inclination is not to stop and to think and to pray or to feel or any of that stuff. Is like, do something, fix it, make it right. Do I have any amens out there, right? Okay. Now here's the good news for all of you who are brave enough to raise your hands with me, is that you've got really good company in Peter, the Apostle Peter, right? The guy who's in prison here. Because that's what he did. Usually he just said something stupid, right? Immediately, right? It just came out of his mouth. He was this action guy. It's like, let's do something. Let's do something. And the doing that God wants us to do when we are experiencing crisis is what we see modeled here in the church, is to recognize that we need to go to the one who is most powerful and all-powerful. And with the arrest of Peter, the followers of Jesus were left without any resources, without any options. And in the face of a dictator, you have no power. You have no recourse. So they prayed. They prayed. In whatever situation you find yourself up against, the more dire, the greater the crisis, the greater the power imbalance, I want you to understand and know is that you always have access to the one who is the ultimate power in the universe, the God of all creation, through Jesus Christ. It's one of the beauties and the powers of following Jesus and of the faith that we have, is that there's nothing that is more powerful, there's nothing greater than God. And God moves in this situation. It's part of the tension of this situation that we find ourselves in. As James has been killed, Peter's in prison, and God goes on the move. And the story, again, helps us to sort of understand and to see the movement of God. And we see here that God moves just in time. Have you ever noticed that about your life? Is that God just sort of shows up just in time? You're like, couldn't you have done this a little bit sooner? I mean, couldn't you have moved a little bit, spoken a little bit quicker? Couldn't something have happened like yesterday or last week? Why are we waiting for the last moment here, God? And when Herod was about to bring Peter out, on the very night Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. So this is the situation. It's like, and Peter had to have had some idea of timing what was going on here. It's like, okay, nothing's going to happen over the Passover. Everybody's focused on feasting, and everybody's focused on the celebration that we have. But when that's over, stuff's going to happen. Things are going to hit the fan. And he knew what was going on. And here we are the night before, and God steps in. And we have this, this great story in Acts 12, 7 through 10, that has these amazing details to it of what took place, right? So Peter's there, he's being guarded, he's chained on each side, he's got a soldier on each side, and then he's got soldiers at the doors that would lead to the exit. There are 4 groups of soldiers that have been tasked with guarding him, because remember, Peter had escaped from prison before. This is not the first time, right? Herod hadn't forgotten that. The last time, they end up back into the temple area preaching again, sort of freaking the leaders out. So they're aware, this guy, he can get out. So they're going to make sure he doesn't get out. So an angel shows up, light switch goes on, light there, and all of a sudden, Peter gets whacked in the side, and that's what it says there. He got whacked, right? He's asleep. He got struck by the angel. It's like if you've ever had somebody, wake you up out of a dead sleep, where they slap you on the chest or slap you on the shoulder or kick you in the leg. That's sort of the picture that's going on here. It's like Peter's like, whoa, what's going on? Chains drop off of his arms, but he's the only one apparently awake. And the angel just has to walk him through. Get up, get dressed, put your sandals on, walk with me, okay? And it's this amazing story, and there's this extraordinary thing that is happening, and in the midst of it, Peter's confused. He's like, what's going on? Because he thinks it's a vision. Because if you remember, he had another vision before he went and visited Cornelius, right? This big sheet comes down, and there's all these, animals in there, and he has this voice that says, eat, and it's all this big thing. So he's used to having these visions that are not, they're taking place in the spiritual realm, but not in the physical realm. And so he sort of thinks that that's what's going on. And in verse 9, it says, and he went out and followed him, and he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. And the angel leads him out, and, sort of, again, some of these great details. They come up to the gates. That's the first automatic door we see in the Bible, right? It's like, ring, everybody's asleep, walk out. I can just sort of, it's like, were they looking around, or is just, strolling out like a boss? Like, hey, just go this way. Keep going. And they get out into the street, go down one street and go to, turn to this other street, and then all of a sudden the angel's gone. Boom. And it's sort of this reminder, it's like, okay, what's Peter going to do now? When God moves, and we can see that and experience that, but it's not passive on our part. Peter had to get up, he had to get dressed, he had to follow. And then at one point, it's like, okay, I've done my part, God says. Now, Peter, continue in the part that you need to do. And sometimes we can clearly understand God. We can see exactly what he's doing. When Peter came to himself, he said, now I'm sure that the Lord has sent the angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. So Peter's like, okay, angel's not here. What am I going to do? So he goes to where the church is gathered. He goes to Mary's house in verse 12. And just a real quick aside here is that a lot of times we can sort of see some of these details and we can gloss over them. But here's just a little bit of an insight, again, to what was going on in the early church and the radical shift that is happening. That the church that is gathered to pray in the house of Mary. And Mary is the mother of another guy named John, also Mark. This is the author of the Gospel of Mark. That's the connection sort of Bible thing there. Again, John and stuff was a common name, so that's why it's John Mark. But the really interesting thing is that Mary was a leader within the early church. A woman was a leader in the early church. It was her home that the church was gathered in. And in a patriarchal society, in a patriarchal religious structure of Judaism, that was a radical thing. That she is identified by name as a part of the story of the early church. It's this whole Paul where he says, in Christ there's neither male nor female, nor Jew nor Greek. We're followers of Jesus. And so we're seeing this radical thing that God is doing, has been doing through the church. Now, as we read the story, and it's hard not to laugh at this part of the story, where sort of the humorous nature of what takes place next when Peter shows up at the door. So the church is gathered together. A group of people are gathered together here in Mary's house. And you have to, again, don't be thinking about Placerville, going up to somebody's, gate and knocking on the gate, where the idea of El Dorado County is find a place where you're as far away from your neighbors you possibly can be, right? If I smell them, see them, hear them, or whatever, I'm too close, right? That is not the context we're talking about here. The context we're talking about here is, think about San Francisco, right? Driving through San Francisco and seeing all those different colored houses where there is no separation between the houses. And if you have a postage size stamp, lawn, you're doing really good. Everybody's there together. This is in the city. This is Jerusalem. And so people are stacked upon each other. But as you will find oftentimes still within the Middle East and within Africa, is that even in those contexts, that there's going to be sort of this security measure that there'll be a gate, a yard that you have to go through. You have to go through that gate in order to get to the front door. And so that's where Peter is that he's knocking out on this gate. There are other houses. It's in the middle of the night, so probably, not that many people, or if anybody around. He's knocking. Rhoda, who is the servant, she's a slave within the household, but clearly a follower of Jesus as well. She knows Peter well enough that she recognizes his voice, doesn't even open the door, right? She's so excited, she runs back and says, Peter's at the door. And they're like, no, he's not. Yes, he is. No, he's not. Yes, he is. It's like, you see this fight going on. There says, no, it's his angel, because there was this belief within that time that we had an angel that looked like us, sound like us, that could be representative of us in different places, particularly after we died. And so you almost get this vision here, is that here you have the church of God gathering together. They're a powerless group of people. They're praying in a situation, but they don't quite believe that their prayers are going to make a difference. Have you ever been there? And when they do, they're like, what? Peter? No, it's not Peter. It's his angel. It's his spirit. Finally, Peter's still out there. Come on, knock. Hey, open the door. He's trying not to be too loud, wake up the neighbors, all that stuff. Finally, they come back and they open up the gate. And again, I think it's just such a great picture to paint. He's here on the street. They're all back behind the gate. They pull the gate open. Everybody's looking at him. He's looking at them like, wow, dude, he's real. He's there. He doesn't go in. He gives them instructions and then he disappears, because he wanted to protect them. It's an amazing story of God's intervention in Peter's life, who is almost guaranteed to end up dead, like his friend James. And yet God, in his wisdom and his mercy and his will, chooses to deliver Peter. When we come to the end of the story here in verses 18 and 19, we see a couple other things that can sort of throw us off. It says, now when day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. This is sort of a formal language here where it says no little disturbance. What it means is there was a really big disturbance. Like, where's Peter? Where's Peter? Where's Peter? I mean, can you imagine? That would not be a good feeling. And after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries and ordered that they should be put to death. So it was either 12 or 16, I don't know, somewhere in there, soldiers were executed because Peter was delivered by God. A group of soldiers doing their job, and God intervened and they lost their lives. And it's here where the stick hits us in the head or hits us in the solar plexus, in the gut, and we go, that's not fair. That's not right. When we come up against evil, a friend of mine, in some of our conversations quite a while back, he shared that he feels that he really lost his faith, his trust, his belief in God at the point of Sandy Hook. When that guy went into that school and he murdered all those little children. He's like, how could God let that happen? I can't believe in a God like that. See, there's a paradox here, though. And it's the paradox of free will, that we love and cherish our freedom, particularly within this nation. As Americans, I mean, our whole thing, our whole narrative, our whole story is built upon our freedom. Is that we fought and we continue to fight to maintain our freedom. It's one of the greatest hallmarks of our nation's culture and around which most battles are fought still today. Is that my right to make choices for me without interference from somebody outside. That I can do what I want in the way that I want it. So when we look at abortion rights, it's about my freedom to make my choices. When we look at sexual politics, it's about my right, my freedom to define myself in the way that I see myself. About taxation, right, is about freedom of, don't impinge upon my freedom. Or freedom of speech. I can say what I want in the platforms that I want, in the time that I want. The right to bear arms is about our freedoms. We want to keep our freedoms. We want our freedoms. They're all about my free will. But when it comes to evil, in the world, we are suddenly happy to blame God for what other people do. And we want the freedom to act according to our own will and impulses to be curbed. We want, where is God in there? Where is God? Why didn't God curb my freedom, their freedom? It's curious, isn't it? It's sort of a paradox. See, here's what the Bible tells us. We live in a broken world. It's what the Bible calls sin. We don't like that word, but this is what the Bible calls sin. And we live amongst broken people. Those are sinful people. And we are a part of those sinful people who do hurtful and harmful things to others. Some of them horrendous. Unthinkable. But every one of us is in that mix. Every one of us has done hurtful and harmful things to others because we are sinful. We are broken. And that is true because God created us with the ability to choose. He gave us a free will. And he invited us to respond to his love and his grace and to live in a life where we would be a blessing, not a curse. But he said, we need to choose. And he continues to tell us to choose. If we go back into the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, these are these powerful words where it says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. Right at the back, the beginning of the story, we see this. It's like, choose life, choose blessing, don't choose death, don't choose cursing. And it's still today that God is saying those words to you and I, to the world that we live in. Choose life, that there is a life of blessing that's available to us. And when we don't follow that path, when we don't choose life and blessing, there is death and there is curse. And it doesn't just impact us. Good people get caught in the mess of other people's choices. We hate that. But it's true. And so you have a group of soldiers who lose their life. We don't know anything about them. A group of soldiers who are doing their job, who lose their life because God intervened. We have James, who loses his life. We have Peter, who's delivered by God. Good people get caught in the mess of other people's choices. Don't blame God. Now, here's the other part of it, though. Let's really be honest here. Sometimes faith is living in the tension of the mystery. We want to have it all figured out. We want to know exactly what's going on. Well, why did James die and Peter live? So God obviously must have loved Peter more than he loved James, huh? Why are they being blessed? And they're jerks. They're idiots. I mean, I know some bad things about them. But my life seems to be going down the toilet. You know, the opposite direction. It's like I'm in Australia or something like that, right? You know, swirling. What is going on? Sometimes faith is living in the tension of the mystery. And I think this is where we can go back again to the story of Joseph, of some of these stories that God has given us to help us to sort of make sense of life. Joseph, back in the book of Genesis, has this story, it was a really sordid story. His brothers sell him into slavery, and he ends up sort of this mountain peak and this valley life as he lives through this. And for like 40 years, long time. And then finally, he's reunited with his brothers. They don't know it's him. Joseph has all this power and authority. He has actually now the power and the authority of life and death over his brothers, where his brothers sold him into slavery. And Joseph says to them, because they're afraid, they figured out who he is, that Joseph's going to kill him because of what they did to him. And he says, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." I mean, that's sort of a mind bender, that their evil God allowed in order to bring about his greater purposes. If you only live for this life, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But if you live for a greater life, a greater kingdom, then you will find peace. God can be trusted, especially when we don't understand. God can be trusted, especially when it just seems most confusing. When life doesn't turn out the way that you want or expect, we stand at a crossroads. We stand at the crossroads, and we really do have a choice. We have a choice when we stand at that crossroads, when life goes sideways and it's not happening the way that we thought or the way that we think God should be acting or should have acted. We can become bitter, or we can become better. We can be deeper rooted, or we can become insincere. We can walk toward Jesus, or we can walk away from Jesus. The choice is ours. We have a choice. I met a guy here recently, and he had just recently been released from 32 years in prison. And he was telling me his story, and he was just a sort of fascinating individual. He's one of the most peaceful individuals that I've sort of just sat across from. And as I'm hearing his story, So apparently when you get released from prison, they give you your paperwork, and he was reading through his paperwork from his time. And when he read through it, he realized that he could have been eligible for parole at 19 years. But nobody told him. He didn't know. And so there was another 13 years he was in prison. Now, in his story, he told about that the first 15 years were about him. The next 15 years were about allowing God to work on him. And during that time that he worked in the chaplain's office, he was an assistant, and he learned some amazing things about himself and about ministry and about God and his faithfulness. And he said, God and I had a conversation. We had a talk about this, 13 years, no doubt. But I had to choose, can I trust God? Did he know what I needed? And he says, I do. That he knew where I needed to be and what I needed in my life. And so I'm not bitter. God can be trusted. So what you're going through, what you're experiencing in your life right now, I don't know. God does. He knows down to the very details that you aren't even aware of, and you can trust him. God can be trusted. Trust God. And that beginning of that trust is saying yes to Jesus. That at some point we have to give over control. We have to give over our lives and trust him and say yes to Jesus, his death and his resurrection, of what he did on the cross. This card that's in the chair in front of you that says say yes to Jesus, there's a prayer on there that's about taking this step of trusting Jesus. Have you done that? Will you do that? But then it's this lifelong, it's a lifelong daily choice. Particularly when life is a mystery, to trust Jesus, to trust God. And you can trust him. Let's pray. God, I know this morning that there are people who are going through all kinds of things, where there is much more mystery than there is clarity. There's much more pain and questions than there are answers. And I pray, Heavenly Father, that we would be a people together that would love each other in the mystery and be graceful and merciful and supportive and kind. That we would truly be free to be who we are, as you have invited us to come to you in whatever condition, whatever place we are. And Jesus, I pray as well that as we love each other in the mystery of the life that we find ourselves in this moment, that we would also be open to your work. Thank you, God, that you are trustworthy, that this life that we are living is greater than us. It's greater than what's going on in our individual lives, but you care deeply about those details. And thank you that you have given us a greater kingdom, a greater hope, a greater life, a greater promise. Help us to remind each other, to encourage each other in that, and to live towards that, even as we live faithfully today. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.